Is standing by. Good morning, John.
Off a day. Hi, Chris and Sabrina. Am I coming in okay?
You're coming in okay. Yes, you are. Relay, relay.
Always have to do that at the beginning of every Zoom call these days.
Right. I mean, it's the new norm. Zoom. Thanks for joining us, John. I guess we'll just give you the floor as we always do to start. What's the update with the Department of Education? That's such a wide question.
Yeah, well, so I would just say that the priority this week has really been kind of shifting focus back to the budget that was, that basically got approved, vetoed, overridden, and so forth. And before we start the fiscal year, the board, has to come back and kind of give some guidance on the spending plan. Even though I have a pretty broad authority to transfer and make sure that things work throughout the year on a day-to-day basis. The board does have to approve a spending plan and really just to highlight the priorities for the department and to understand the impacts of the budget so that we can communicate with our stakeholders. So the bottom line for this budget is that we are experiencing a $15.1 million cut from last year's budget. 2.5 of that is something that is an amount we're supposed to get back once GITA refinances the JFK certificates of participation. So that should happen in October. But the remainder of that cut, which is going to be about 12.5 million, I briefed the board yesterday on some of the impacts and some of the steps we would need to take to try to adjust to that. And of course, since 2018, the FY 2018 budget, because of the federal tax cuts, we've already gone through a cut process, a very public and painful one, that brought us down about $14 million. So this additional $15 million cut, means a $30 million reduction over the past couple of years. So, I think the other, part of it is during COVID-19, there's a lot of uncertainties that we're having to deal with. Number one is we've got to continue operations, continue to carry out our mission of education, our frontline response during the midst of this pandemic, as well as with the budget cut, on top of that. But at the same time, the board's also asked whether we would achieve savings from the different ways in which we're going to be operating this year, most notably not having any students on campus, for several months. So we had a discussion yesterday, and I basically told them that, of the $15 million, there are definitely things that we can do to cut expenses. Things like, again, what we've done in the past, just freeze all hiring, especially at the central office, which we've done, and we've held those vacancies, vacant. But that'll alleviate some of the pressure on the schools by making sure that we prioritize school-based personnel. It's forced us to go back again to our vendors and start to renegotiate our contracts. Custodial, solid waste, and other essential contracts. And then, of course, we've tried to factor in savings that we might see on the utility side. Already, we anticipate that we can probably achieve a 15% reduction in utilities, given the fact that we are going to be operating the 3 models of learning, during the course of this school year. So, I told them that, but based on the list of options that we have, we can probably, close the gap by about $10 million. And that leaves us with about $4 million, $4 to $5 million that we still have to find a way to save. So we're still working on that. And obviously the board gives me some of that flexibility to make the decisions on that front. But of course, if there are difficult decisions that require the board's involvement and action, and also interaction with the community, we have to, let people know if there's going to be more difficult cuts that are coming. I think the only thing I would note as a big challenge is that I've informed the board that when we close schools, like we do, like we're doing now, where nobody's on campus except maybe the teachers and staff, that saves us an extra $1 million, a quarter. However, we don't want to make our decisions about schools and kids based only on the budgetary factor. So those are some of the policy issues about opening and reopening that the board will have to make eventually. Mm-hmm. But again, so that's the number one priority. On tomorrow at the board meeting, the board will be approving its spending plan and highlighting some of the challenges ahead that we can anticipate for the department.
Mm-hmm. Just
So that's on the budget. I think on the other side, again, you probably heard about the technology and the internet discussion. So this week, schools are pushing out the applications to students, to our secondary, our middle and high school students, to let the schools know if they need a laptop, so they can move on to the online um, uh, model of learning. And then hopefully over the next week, we can start the distribution of that equipment to our students and begin to expand the models of learning. So for those who have been asking and waiting and trying to, figuring out how can we get a laptop, the answer is your schools. You need to contact your school directly. They will be providing that application. Some have started already, and some are preparing tomorrow on Friday to get those out. It's not a first come first serve. It really is based on need, ensuring that you have the appropriate internet access at this point. When we think we have enough equipment to really take care of all the secondary school students. But again, it's not going to be first come first serve. It's really going to be allocated based on what you provided as far as your information this summer in terms of your computer and internet access, and then just updating that information to make sure that you are in need of the equipment. And we're continuing to work with the governor's office on the internet solution. So I know that the lieutenant governor has been, waiting for the approval from USDOE for the funding needed to support their use of education funds. And about $8.9 million of their funds is being dedicated to home internet access. And their intention is to subgrant that to to GDOE, and for us to procure internet access for the households. So, we've just started that process because it's not yet approved, but we intend to go through a procurement process to try to bridge the gap for those who need internet access in order for them to move online. So those are two things that I know the community has been very, very interested in addressing. So I'll stop there, and if there's any other, items that you want to discuss, I'm happy to, get more information.
yeah, I just wanted to follow up on some of the things you were discussing regarding the $15.1 million cuts or the $12.5 million. You said that utilities, you're seeing a 15% reduction, but was that based on schools being closed and it's just online learning for the entire school year?
The 15% reduction in utilities anticipates that we will be able to operate fully with the three models of learning. So it does anticipate that we would have the rotating, the alternating schedules of kids on campus. So we didn't provide a more aggressive savings target, because we assume that at some point students should be back on campus, and we wanted to ensure that we accounted for those costs. So 15% is really a conservative estimate. If we continue to be in P-Core 1 or P-Core 2, where we cannot open schools to students, we anticipate the possibility of saving even more on the utility side, the power and the water consumption.
Mm-hmm. And so you said you still have to cut then the 4.5 million. So what are you kind of looking at? What's on your radar?
So I think part of what it is working through the first quarter to see how closely our estimates are tracking. So for instance, with utilities, we're looking at with a 15% reduction, that's a $2.6 million savings over the course of the year. So part of that will be to look and see if our estimates are tracking, through the months. And in that first quarter, it will be the real test to see, how cash is coming in, how we're paying our bills, and how those adjustments are being made to ensure that we're within our budget. There are, and then as we get to the end of the first quarter, which typically is the toughest quarter of the year in terms of cash flow, we'll be talking to the board about anything more serious or anything deeper that we need to go into to discuss, with our stakeholders, should it impact employees and families. I know that the board has considered going back to the legislature and governor with a supplemental budget request immediately following their approval of the spending plan, in this at tomorrow's board meeting. And the supplemental request will identify these are the items that are unfunded And if the governor and legislature would like to fund these, we would like you to identify any sources of revenue that might be available or become available, later on this fiscal year. So I think the board is going to be able to identify the areas that are unfunded and go back to the legislature and governor and say, if there's any additional revenues or higher revenues that come in, please prioritize the DOE's activities.
Are you guys foreseeing the third party? I know there was some news about the third party fiduciary, right, situation where by January you guys are hoping to get off of this, and then that would bring in some savings to GDOE.
Yeah, there are a couple areas where we think that there might be room for additional savings that we have not put on the initial list of the $10 million in cuts. So let me just clarify that. Of the 15.1 million, 2.5 we expect to be reimbursed by GITA. And of course, that really depends on getting that refinancing done and to hit that estimate of savings that they anticipate. And then 9 million on top of that is really coming from just basically, withholding, stopping spending in certain areas, meaning renegotiating contracts and freezing hiring or delaying hiring and so forth. So that's another $9 million. There is I did put on the table $1 million of additional savings, assuming that we aren't going face to face through the end of December. And that's a really kind of major policy decision that's not yet made. But, I've told the board and I've spoken to the Lieutenant Governor, my anticipation is that even though we went from PCOR 3 to PCOR 1 overnight, I don't expect that we're going to go from PCOR 1 to PCOR 3 overnight in the reverse direction. I'm assuming we're going to go into PCOR 2. There'll be an incremental opening of the community, and then PCOR 3, about a month from now or so at least, will be the time where we would be, authorized to open. And I think from the board's preliminary discussions with me is that if we're into mid-November, by the time we're authorized to open face-to-face, then it may not make sense to open for a couple of weeks and then close back down for Christmas break. We might want to go ahead and look at January as the start of any face-to-face instruction at school. So in that case, that would help us on the budget side through the end of this calendar year. So that will leave us again $4 to $5 million. But you're right that we are in the process of renegotiating the third-party contract. We do have to have that contract in place, but we do think there's room for some savings. So we're not yet, adding that to the list until we solidify that negotiation. We have accreditation, a very heavy accreditation schedule, which I think we've set aside $300,000 as an estimated budget need for the accreditation visits. But because we just had a conversation with WASC yesterday, and it looks like they're going to be doing virtual visits or postponing visits for the coming year. So that again will give us additional savings. So there are areas that we're still working on that we still think, due to the pandemic situation, we might be able to push spending into the following year or postpone, this kind of spending. And hopefully in the next budget year, next school year, things will be better. But again, there are some critical policy decisions that'll make it an interesting, dialogue with the board. One is, when and how we reopen schools, because that is a budgetary impact. And we know that if we're going to reopen schools, we have to anticipate less of an ability to save. We're serving meals right now, and right now it's only breakfast, but we anticipate ramping it up to lunch and so forth when the food supply comes in. But we're not technically by federal rule required to serve those meals. And every meal that we served, even though we get federal reimbursement, there is a local subsidy attached to it. About $5.1 million in our budget is set aside to subsidize our meal distribution. So we don't want to get to a point where we have to compromise our ability to serve meals to students. We're doing so. We've chose the option to do so. But I certainly don't want to get to a point where we can't afford that because of the budget cuts. But again, these are things that are on the table for future decision making should the budget not be sufficient to operate.
Wow, that's a pretty big decision you'd have to make if GDOE decides that they're going to have to cut meals.
Yeah, and the other piece that maybe not as important as the meals and the utilities for having face-to-face students back, but interscholastics as a line item was taken out of the budget this year. And I think the board's going to say, well, if you didn't fund interscholastics and you've cut the budget, $15 million, we're going to go back to the governor and legislature to let them know that, even though we're not authorized to do it, if we are authorized later in the year, we'll need the funding to be added back. So that'll be another, I'm sure, debate that will be discussed with them.
Hey, John, Jason here. Real quick, we had a comment from Bev in our chat room right now. And speaking of things that may or may not be cut or at least substantially modified, she was asking something that we were talking about internally just the other day, in fact, is she was saying what becomes of service learning, because that's now become such a fundamental component of the curriculum for public school students.
So last year we addressed service learning with the legislature because it's a requirement in law for service learning, and so they did pass a bill to waive the requirement for the graduates. We went back to that law, and we were working with the vice chair of the Education Committee, Senator Shelton, to clarify that because she was getting a lot of questions. The language in that exemption basically exempted any of the students enrolled in high school during that, the time of the passage of that bill. So if you are a freshman last year, that service learning requirement technically will not be utilized to prevent you from graduating. So for all of those students out there, especially our seniors, the service learning requirements, even though we would like you to continue to have opportunities to improve the community, the service learning requirements are not going to be mandatory for graduation purposes. And so they don't need to worry about that at the same time that they're trying to stay home and stay out from public places and so forth. So no service learning requirements for the graduates and for those actually in the next 2 years of graduating classes.
John, I just wanted to ask, when you talk about the cuts, right? So we had immediately after the override of the budget bill, we saw a press release out of Adelube with public health saying, oh, we're going to furlough 80 people. And then we spoke with Lieutenant Governor Josh Denori yesterday, and he was basically like, it's not going to happen, right? That's kind of what he said. So when you talk about the cuts facing your department, how real is it? Because we've seen this, and I'm not accusing you of posturing or anything, but we've seen it, we just saw it a couple weeks ago where it's like, oh, we got that budget, we got to fire people. So, I mean, these are very real decisions that you guys are being forced to make.
Yeah, I think, when you're managing the budget and you're managing the cuts, I mean, it's really easy even though it's a large budget, it's easy to kind of track where those funds are going. And, 80 to 85% of our budget goes to personnel. And then the rest will go to utilities and essential contracts. So, from the personnel side, you evaluate the staffing at the schools. There are a lot of the parameters that set forth how you staff the schools, including our collective bargaining agreement, which we are still far short of fulfilling. So we're able to kind of look at that. At the central office, we've been able to really delay hiring or cease hiring in positions. But, with the additional responsibilities of managing these federal funds and so forth, the jobs that aren't filled don't go away. They just get absorbed by other people at the central office. So we kind of monitor for burnout and for employees who are just kind of overwhelmed by the responsibility that they're now taking on because of the vacancies that we're holding. But again, we understand that the schools are the priority. Mm-hmm. So, and then of course, we work to renegotiate and work with our vendors to try to get as better, as best a deal as possible in light of the pandemic. So we're going to squeeze the budget as much as possible. If we need to go into further cuts and we start affecting personnel, our first priority is to let our stakeholders know. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's important that our employees know if something's coming up, and we don't want to leave any of our employees out in the cold as well. So as soon as we think that employees might be affected, we're going to let them know early that these are pressures that we just can't avoid in light of the budget trends in the first quarter. We do have permanent classified employees and we do have limited term employees. Each of them have different levels of protections when it comes to maintaining their jobs. And it's a complicated process, to be honest. So it really isn't our first priority. The easiest thing to do is just stop hiring. And so that attrition, through attrition, as people retire, resign, then you can lower the personnel numbers. But again, there is an impact every time you don't fill a vacancy, especially at the schools. Now, because we're online right now, we're virtual. Maybe that can be, maybe we can afford a slight delay in the hiring. But as soon as we start bringing kids back to school, it's going to be important that we have support staff and so forth in place.
Just going back to the food, and you said it was like a $5 million cost, right?
We get about $12 million reimbursement for every meal that that is compliant with our USDA requirements that we serve. So however, that reimbursement doesn't cover the full cost of the meal. So there is a portion of that is subsidized by our local budget. So I believe like 70% of it, maybe 75% of it is covered by the federal government, and then the remainder by our by our local budget. So based on my review, we have about $5 million that it costs us on the local side to keep our school some lunch program going. The challenge is right now is that it's usually if you have kids at school, it's a requirement. But when kids are not at school, it isn't a requirement. But we are opting to serve those meals as much as possible, right, so that we can maintain that support. But again, if the funds aren't there, it'll put us in a very difficult position of having to figure out whether that's something that needs to be looked at. We don't want to look at it and then remove those supports. But again, it'll really come down to where we feel and are able to make the necessary cuts to come in within the budget.
Right. Yeah. And I understand, because this grab and go program, it really helped a lot of people and continues to help a lot of people that don't, get a meal, especially the children.
Yeah, we have about, based on the first couple of weeks of experience with this, as we restarted on the Fridays, about 11,000, students are eating based on the numbers of meals that have been picked up. The first distribution, we were running short, so we raised the number of meals, and I think we're kind of stabilized at about 11,000 of students who are coming to pick up their meal support for the week.
And I bring this up because I remember a time when everything was in April, when Senator Regine Biscoe-Lee had introduced legislation asking that the governor use a part of this CARES Act funding for food, for people that need food. And, that never came to be. And we just saw GDOE, for the most part, just stepping up. Right. And we saw all the long lines.
The governor did put $1 million towards us continuing the program over the summer.
Was that CARES Act funding?
I believe so.
Well, there you go. Maybe
but
you
I
could
think,
get $5 million.
Going forward, if we have any trouble funding the program, that is something that, of course, we'll discuss with the governor and try to ensure that we can keep that going. Should there be resources available to redirect?
Okay. And can I ask one more question, Chris?
Yes, ask two more.
All right. Just that the hard copy, do you still need to have a computer for hard copy for students to learn?
What we're trying to do is, so the hard copy model of learning really is something that I think at the end of the day, we probably want to eliminate because really it's for those students who don't have access to a computer or the internet. So I think the long-term vision is you either go to school when we're safe enough to open up to go to school, or you're online with equipment as well as internet access. So again, as we expand with the distribution of laptops, we think we can move a significant amount of students from that hard copy to the online version. And then hopefully for those who don't have internet access, within a month or two, be able to provide that solution as well. So that's really where the hard copies really are. It's some people do have a computer but they just prefer the hard copy. But for the most part, those are for students who don't have that ready access to the computers or the internet.
How many students would you estimate have been left behind that haven't been able to get any sort of education within GDO?
Right now, again, we talked about an effort to work with the mayors to track down our missing students. The actual mayor outreach hasn't started yet, even though they're raring to go, because we pulled the numbers and the lists of students, and we had about 2,700. And then, again, our social workers asked to take on that list first because they had already been receiving a lot of referrals. So they wanted to make sure they cleaned those lists for those families that they were able to identify and reach. So that process is ongoing right now. And then we had our research arm take a look at preliminary enrollment and what numbers they were seeing. And they were seeing a different number, about 1,800 students so we had about 2,700 we were reporting. Our research arm that uses PowerSchool to pull the data said the decline was about 1,800. Mm-hmm. So they're actually looking to clean those lists up, and we're hoping that number is on the lower side, closer to 1,800. What we're learning from the lists of students is that we're going to be targeting specific schools because there are certain schools where we're seeing a tremendous drop. So one of the worries that I have, for instance, is, and I know folks who are familiar with our school system understand this, that Astumbo Elementary lost about 100, it looks like between 100 and 150 students from their enrollment. And that is not a normal thing. That is not a predictable thing. And it kind of gives us a lot of concern about where those students are and making sure that we have an accurate list, because in that case, there are certain schools that are showing high levels of students who have not been identified and are probably not going to be resolved by saying, oh, they transferred, they left the island, or so forth. So that's where the concern is. Our social workers and our student attendance officers are scrubbing that list as we speak, because there are going to be certain schools that we're really concerned about, certain parts of the community. And I think in those cases, these might be students who are just disconnected completely from some of the supports in the community just due to this pandemic situation, maybe their household situation, their family situation, their economic situation. There may be a number of supports that are needed, in addition to just, being in contact with their teachers. So, that's a big worry. Again, we're hoping to accelerate that with the social workers and student attendance officers, really kind of digging into the individual lists, school by school, and then we hope to continue to update those numbers and see them drop.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess good luck with the laptop application process this week.
Yeah, I mean, these are difficult, changes and shifts, and we're kind of working around the public health situation. As we look ahead 3 or 4 months from now, we're going to be in a great position, a much better position, as everybody gets used to being online, more proficient at handling these online platforms. We've got the kids identified. We kind of identify, how to maintain contact with the kids. The parents and teachers work more closely together to address some of these day-to-day issues. Right now, it's a little frustrating on all fronts because it's brand new and there are still gaps that we're trying to fill. But we really are trying to look at the bright side and the promise of what all these shifts and challenges are requiring us to address. So as a community, to bear with us. We know a lot of discussion between parents, teachers going on, a lot of surprises, positive and negative, that we need to address. But it really is going to take communication, sharing information, updating the community, and hopefully we can all work through this public health situation, together, and try to make the best that we can on the education side, knowing that long term we want our kids back in school when we can. So we just want to thank everybody, our teachers and our parents and our administrators out there for continuing to work with us and keep pushing. We're kind of trying to make this work in the midst of what is otherwise, like Chuck said, a basically disaster recovery. So
right.
Let's look at it in terms of trying to recover and get us back to normal as soon as we're able to.
All right. Thanks a lot, John, for the update. Lots of information. Stay
Okay,
safe.
Appreciate it, John.
You too.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Wash your hands.
Yeah, you too.
Okay. 8:53.
We're going to stay in our Zoom room?
Yeah, we're going to stay in our Zoom room where we sanitize between guests. And now we are very honored to have the chief of the Guam Police Department, Chief Steve Ignacio, and he's being joined by the spokesperson for the police department, Sergeant Paul